Afternoon, everyone. All that are joining us, thank you for coming. We are waiting a little bit for more people to join. Thanks for being here. We have already 25 participants. I'm just going to wait a couple of seconds more, and then we proceed. So, welcome everyone to the Bern Lectures in Health Science of 2021. It's very nice to see you all. Good afternoon, and I'll give you a word to my colleague Thomas Auer to proceed with the introduction of our speaker of today. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Oscar. And a hearty welcome also from my side to the third input in our lecture series. That lecture series has a focus on science for practice, as you may remember. We started the series with the input by Professor Thomas Zeltner, who was addressing key challenges in the collaboration and the non-collaboration between science and policy making, as you may remember. And then last month we had Tom Shakespeare. Many of us were intrigued by Tom's presentation, where he addressed the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis particularly on handicapped and disabled person, which in fact means also on the whole society, including us. Many of us were really enthusiastic about how Tom presented this, and he relied very much on qualitative data and personal experience and observation to make his point, and he got his point across strongly. Today, our third presentation in the series is quite a strong contrast, because Professor Campostrini, his work relies mostly on quantitative data. So while the data is very different, the aim of these presentations still are the same, because the aim is to show how public health research can be produced and presented in a way that we can have an impact in practice, including health policies, social policies at large. So today it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Stefano Campostrini to our ISPM Lecture Series 2021. The questions you may raise, please do. The comments you may have, please use our chat function. We will try to accommodate afterwards whatever is in the chat. And of course, we will have an open discussion. And Stefano already told me he's looking forward to this as well. Now, Stefano is a professor of social statistics at the University of Venice. I know many of us would like that job. He has an impressive career in public health and health promotion research, and especially in his work that helps advising WHO, so major public health institutions, but also national governments. So today we are particularly pleased to have Stefano with us. Stefano, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours. The virtual floor is yours. Please, Stefano.
Well, thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Oscar, for the invitation. As I said to you, can say to everyone, I'm very glad to be with you this evening. I would have been much more glad to be with you in Bern. Hopefully, we will organize another this meeting and in presence, and hopefully will be soon. Let me share my presentation with you. And this one. Okay. And what I would like to address this afternoon is some research that we are doing on longevity. And particularly, I've been stimulating my research. Actually, I'm not, I studied demography when I was much younger. Then I was not interested in demography anymore. And instead, in the recent year, I put together a group that is quite composite, because there are some epidemiologists, someone that is studying demography, some very good statistician, and my team that is in social statistics, try to study longevity and to see longevity, to learn from changes in longevity from a particular perspective, that is that of public health. As Thomas mentioned, one of my chief interests in research, and particularly health promotion. So are there something that we can learn? Let me tell that at the beginning, I wasn't not too much interested in mortality and longevity, because for me it was too distal from the action. Instead, looking at the data, as I will try to do, sharing some data with you, I realized that, well, there is a lot we can learn. It is not so distal, and actually, it is an handout and health outcome that is highly comparable across countries and within countries. And this clear indication, this clear indicator of health, I think it is very useful to understand the mechanism behind it, and if these can be linked, as many of us think, to other public health issues, such as health inequality and so forth. So let us start from a very broad picture. We are in the middle of what is called the epidemiological transition. And when we address mortality and longevity, we must acknowledge this. If 100 years ago, we look at the picture of diseases and mortality, this was a completely different picture. More than 50% in the Western countries of people were dying because of infectious diseases. A very small percentage were dying of cardiovascular diseases, very few of cancer, and well, as you can see, violence has been one cause of death that unfortunately has maintained pretty high over the years. And then there were other causes, and that accounted for something as 20%. The transition over the years has changed completely the picture. Infectious disease, and also now that this picture is still valid during the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic, of course, has changed a bit this picture, but not substantially, in a sense that the cardiovascular diseases are still also in the 2020 the first cause of death, the first cause of morbidity, and so the picture is still this one. One of the effects of this epidemiological transition, together with other, well, of course, incidentally, one of the main causes of this transition can be attributed to vaccination. And so nothing new under the sun. of course, there are other causes as the quality of health systems, but still a big chunk of this transformation, if you look at the years, started when the vaccination campaign started among the population. So this speed, the speed of this change has been made mainly by that. But this has caused one phenomenon that we are observing, we have observed over the years, and we are observing in, I would say, in all the countries of the world, because the speed of aging of the population is different from country to country, but the level is different, but the transition is happening everywhere. So population in most of the country of the world, I would say all, but most of the country of the world is aging. Is aging also in the recent years, and this is one of the interesting aspect. So it's not something that has happened just 50 years ago and then stopped. It's not like this big change that we have seen has happened basically 50 years ago. This is happening now. And these are figures for Italy, but then we will see also some figures for other countries that are pretty similar. So this is the life expectancy at birth in Italy as it was for the male population in the 90s, 73. Now it's more than 80. So in the last 30 years, a big change, and is still increasing. Same for female, and particularly what has changed is the life expectancy at the age of 65. So around when people retired. So if when my father retired, the life expectancy was more or less than 15 years. Now it's almost 20 for male, higher, much higher for female. This of course it has caused and is causing a big change in the population that has a direct impact on also on public health, because we have increased the percentage of elderly in a very substantial way. This is the figure for Switzerland that I found in the net, and if you see that the elderly population, considering elderly, those that have more than 65 years, was only 10% in the 60s. Now we are speeding up, and these are the forecasting from the OECD for the year 2050, in which there will be more than 30% of the population. We now in Switzerland there are more or less 20% of the population that is part of the. But let's take this other aging index that is the population over 65 over the population under 14. Well, these are few countries of the EU. While one of the first aspects that you can appreciate the differences that are between country and country. There are countries like Italy and Germany that are pretty old. Some country in which, as Ireland, France, country for which the cultural aspect, Ireland, or the policy that they've introduced has allowed a completely different fertility rate. This is mainly fertility rate that makes this difference. But let's stay on the numbers. So this is, when I explain this indicator to my students, I try to explain using this metaphor. You should take this as how many elderly people are watching young people playing. So go think of your soccer field, or think of your gymnasium. And when I grew up in the 60s, this index was 40. This means that if for 10 children playing, there were 4 elderly persons watching. Now it's almost 200. It means that for 10 people playing, there are 20, and not 4, 20 elderly people watching. This is a major change, not just a small change. This is a major change that, of course, has a great impact both on the society and on our health systems, because as we know, elderly population typically require much more resources. But this, of course, I was talking also about society, because, of course, it is a problem for the retirement scheme. It is a problem for the labor forces. This is, again, Switzerland, and this is the age dependency ratio that is given by elderly population over population in labor age. As you can see, starting from the 75, it has decreased a lot. Then it has gone a bit up and down, probably following also specific policy that are, from one side, supporting families. From the other side, we know migration has a big impact on these data. So just to give you an idea of the dramatic change that has happened over the years, this is what in demography is called the pyramid of age, because it used to be that we had a good amount of children, then less than the same amount, but still consistent part of adult population, and a very small part of elderly. That it is why it is called the pyramid of age. This is a situation, actually, the actual situation is even worse than this, and it is not a pyramid anymore. Because of a drop in fertility rate, this is Italy, the number of younger population is getting smaller and smaller. Here are called the baby boomers. Just after the war, during the economic expansion of the 60s and the 70s, we had a lot of children. But the other relevant aspect, the increase in the elderly population is among us. And it's going to increase, particularly this part of the population, the over 80, is going to increase even more in the next decades. So this is to say that having a strong impact on society and on the health systems, this aspect must be studied. And one of the interesting side of this study is to study the differences in longevity patterns. So I was watching during the Christmas time the difference in longevity trends between Italy and US. Italy spend less than 10% of its GDP, 9% actually, in health services. US spent 20% of its GDP in health services. Plus, the average GDP in US is 50% higher than Italy. Nevertheless, if the trend of longevity, it has been more or less the same, these are men, these are women, it remains more or less the same until the middle 80s, the increase in Italy has been much, much more important than in the US. Then in the last part, actually, there is a change in the pattern, and US this is before COVID. In US, as you can see, the increase has stopped in around the year 2015, particularly for male population, but a bit also for female. Why it's happening? So we have tried, with the help of my colleagues, we have tried to study a bit. This is the source is a human mortality database. So we have several countries of the world. We can do this comparison. And we have, with the help of our statistician, we have tried to observe these changes over time. And for those interested, I would not spend too much on this. Actually, the models are a bit sophisticated. They are Bayesian and non-parametric mixture of splines, but I will not linger over this. We have tried to model the difference, okay? This has allowed us, this is still Italy and this is the US. To have a model means to have also confidence interval, nice confidence interval, fine. All these other lines are all the other countries. As you can see, there are several countries, some 50 countries. The trend is the same. The speed is different. The speed is different. Some country, these are likely the Eastern European countries has started this process later than the other Western countries. Someone is faster, as Italy. Someone is slower, as the US. But what we are trying to model is this: the probability of the two trends to be the same. As you can see, starting from 85, the probability is basically zero. So the difference between the two trends is increasing. And this is this was for men. This is for women. It's even more clear. Using this model, we can add possible causes of these differences. So we can study these, technically they are called trajectories, trying to observe other trajectories. So the first step, it has been to study the causes of death. And what we have seen some changes in the causes of death and taking the big causes. At the beginning, we have seen basically nothing because we were taking the causes of death, all the causes of death. And but of course, if a country has more longevity than another country, the composition of the causes of death are influenced by this longevity. For instance, the number of cancer increased a lot because for the life exposition is much longer. So eventually you have to die for something. So that for countries like Japan, like Sweden, like Italy, that have a long longevity, well, those are facing much more cancer at the end of the life. But this is not something that we can interpret as the composition in longevity. So we have taken into account only premature mortality, mortality before the age 70. And we see different trends. We see, for instance, respiratory diseases has changed a lot in Italy, while it has been quite stable over time. But respiratory disease account for only 8% of all death. The same we can say for other digestive system diseases has changed a bit in Italy after the 85. So this can be related with the changes we have observed. But again, these are not big changes. So it's not the cause of death that has changed. Something else has caused those differences in the trajectory. Well, take a look at this slide. This is obesity. Obesity in Italy and obesity in the US. Both are increasing, as in everywhere in the world, but the speed, the pace of increase is absolutely different. And certainly, as many of us know, the risk factor, the behavioral risk factor, play a very important role in explaining the health outcome. And if you can read also the number here, the scale, unfortunately, we do not, we cannot make the same comparison with the same sources before the 75. Now we are trying to estimate at least what has happened before the 75. But if you can see, the increase start to be different just in the middle 80s, in which for Italy, the increase is pretty linear, while for the US, the increase, particularly in the 80s and in the 90s, it has been exponential. So this is these are possible causes, but as we know, there are causes of the causes. So can we relate this also with some other differences, those that some of us is interested in studying, as we call inequalities? Well, take a look at these graphs. These are income inequality in the US. The upper line is the pre-tax national income of the top 10% of the population. Steady increase. And particularly this increase is higher starting in the year 85. Instead, the bottom 50% that in the 70s, sorry, had 20% of the total wealth, well, started to decrease steadily. And now it has almost 5% of the total wealth. In Italy, well, the trend is similar, but this is pre-taxation. In Italy, we have a quite relevant progressive taxation system. So before taxation, well, the trend is similar. Still, look at the scale. This is not 0, this is 20. So the The bottom 50% that is in blue in this slide, this graph, is getting down, but is getting to the 20%, not to the 5% of the US. And then after taxation, as you can see, these differences are much, much less. If you take wealth as a whole, so not only income, but the wealth that is held by the top 10% again, and the bottom 50%, the difference are even more surprising in some way, not for everyone, but I think for the common person are certainly surprising. We are seeing that particularly after the 80, the top 10% has more than 70% of the total wealth, while the net personal wealth of the bottom 50% is very near to zero. I'm talking about inequality in income, but inequality in income, particularly in a country in which the system, the health system, is not universal, well, has a big impact on health. And not only in the bad health, but in the between, that is, again, the risk factors, as we have seen. And this is the figures of the some risk factors: smoking, obesity, hypertension, by income classes in the US. So with perhaps some exception in obesity, that is a kind of, it's not so weird. Actually, if we take overweight, the figures would have been slightly different. But in the upper class, as you can see, obesity is much lower than in the other classes. Instead, the trend is linear for hypertension, 29 for, this is the family income. For family income pretty low, and then going down until the upper one. Smoking prevalence, 24% in the lower class, 7% in the upper class. Eventually, these differences hit longevity. This is again in Italy, that we have seen differences among classes are smaller, but still look at the differences in longevity. This is, you can take the probability of survival, of being alive at a certain age. Of course, in near the 70, near the 60, most of the population is still alive, and then we start to die. We start to die differently. The speed of death in the lower class, it's much, much, much different than in the upper class. This is for male. For male is even more clear than female. So if you take at the age of 80, 50% of the lower class has already died, while only 40% of the upper class has died. These are huge differences. So this is already, from my point of view, is already a complex scenario. And so that raises really several questions. Why has happened? And what can we do about that? But before moving from data to policy, that is what has been stimulated by Thomas, and I'm much interested in doing that. Let's have a look at the possible COVID effect. because I think it's very interesting. Viruses are said to be democratic, but their effect is not a democratic. They eat the fragile population differently. And also the COVID-19 in a different way, because we know it's not just a matter of being older, it's a matter of having comorbidity. And comorbidity, again, are much, much higher in prevalence in the lower class. Have a look at this data from the US. This is the life expectancy trend for by race. As you can see, the Black population has always had a lower level of life expectancy at birth than the white one. This gap was in some way it was getting better since the 90s, and so this gap was was filling up. And more interestingly, the Latino population has a much better life expectancy than even the white one. This is because of the behavioral risk factors. But what has happened after COVID? Wow. In just 1 year, the life expectancy of the Latino population have lost all the advantage over the white population. And what about the Black population? Well, they've lost all what they gained in the last 15 years in comparison with the white population. Impressive. I do not have yet data on the differences inside of countries, beside of that of the US with the race. And I do not have data for Italy. I do not have data for Switzerland, if not the global, the general burden on the mortality in 2020. And of course, the figures are quite relevant. I mean, these are the last work that the group I'm directing has done, and I hope it will be published soon, because that difference that you have seen actually is an underestimate, unfortunately. We have done better estimate, and in the US, they have lost 1.7 years of life expectancy in 2020. In Switzerland, 1 year, with a big difference between female and male. Male more than 1 year, female 0.8 year. In Italy, a bit more, and actually we missed the last month of observation, so it will be more than that. It will be similar to probably to US. In England, 1.5. So there are the effect of COVID pandemic. It has been quite shocking. And we can expect, for the reason that I mentioned, and for the early data that we have seen from the US, that the differences, the inequality will be really, really important. Going to the lesson learned. In terms of goal, well, I hope that in this quick talk, I've been able to express how longevity is a complex phenomenon. It's fairly simple to read, and that's why I think also from a public health point of view, it's easy to communicate. It's the result of several dynamics. It's important to study. I think inequality and longevity should be addressed more than it has been done in the past, because understanding longevity could help to address inequalities. That is a big issue, because we know that we observe now, we have tons of data that what it was stated in the Marmot report, in the WHO report of 2008, Closing the Gap was a title, and subtitle In a Generation. Well, we are not closing that gap. We are not closing at all that gap. And unfortunately, as we have seen, we have several signals that that gap is increasing. So, which are the pathways? Well, certainly we need better study, we need comparison, and I've mentioned why I've also myself start to be interested in this kind of study, because comparison between countries are easy. It's the same indicator. You cannot say, well, but you measure death in a different way. No, death is death, and we are all measuring death in the same way. I think are promising because they can understand the mechanism, and most importantly, this could help to target intervention and to have a health promotion approach. From my point of view, can be very relevant and very important. And in the lateral slide, perhaps this will be more clear. For the risk that we are facing, policy and intervention targeted to the general population have failed in the last years. And this is because what you see, one of the reasons is because what you see in the little cartoon, I hope you can read that, but I think you know the difference between equality and equity, because most of these intervention have the idea to be equal. Also, our universal system in Italy is equal, but equal is not enough. Those that are not so well off, those that are more fragile, well, they do not need the same intervention of the better off. They need additional intervention. They need specific intervention to get to the same level of the better off. If we do not understand this lesson, most of our public health intervention will fail in reducing inequalities. Another risk that I see talking about longevity is that I see just one part of the, well, can be interpreted looking only to one part of the picture, that is illness and not health, and is looking at distant problems and not present ones. But as I showed also with American figures that are very interesting, if longevity, and particularly if we break down the longevity curve by education, as someone has done, and race, we see actually that the longevity curve for low educated women, black, is going down. It's not gaining more, it's losing. The other risk is that we are dealing with complex problems, complex issue. Are too difficult to address? Well, this is one of the questions. Well, ways to avoid risk. Well, the first one, I've already stated that. We should have our decision maker to understand what are the major differences between equity and equality, and to understand how can we have policy that are targeted to equity. The other way to avoid this this threat, I think, and in some way it is difficult, particularly for politicians that are looking for the next election, is to have a long-term vision. But I think we have an opportunity right now. Most of the people, most also of the politicians, are understanding the issue of sustainability, are agreed on SDGs, and SDGs put our policy in the long-term vision. And I think we should take this opportunity. And the last related to complexity, we should remember the saying that for every complex problem, there is always a simple solution that eventually will be proved wrong. So, and I think that the role of academic is quite important in this, in showing that we should not fear complex solution. And the complex, we should take the challenge of understanding complexity. And that's why I am so proud of this group that I put together of different discipline, statistician, very good in making complex problems, but curious of finding the complex method because the problem is complex, not just because they love complexity. And eventually trying to find a solution and understanding that could make sense. Well, this is with a big hope that in the next future we will have a more equitable society, because we all recognize, taking the word of Dr. Martin Luther King, that of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhumane. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stefano. And is this really true that Martin Luther King said this, or did you put the health in?
No. I've taken the from Martin Luther King.
Okay.
Let me switch on my lights because
very good.
It's dark. I'm back.
So yeah, thanks so much. I find this really fascinating. And one thing that I still have in mind is what happened in the 1980s. I didn't know that. So thank you very much for making us all aware of then. And then, of course, what can we draw? What kind of conclusions or research questions? I find all this very fascinating. So I want to open up the floor to questions that our audience might have at that point. Oscar, I see you are unmuted.
Thank you, Thomas. Stefano, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Yes, it's quite worrying what is happening with the impact of life expectancy on the population, and you remark about Latinos in the American population, but nevertheless, you might have seen these figures from the Spanish flu pandemic, when we lost approximately 4 years of life expectancy within a period of 2 years. But what was really remarkable was the plasticity of life expectancy and of the aging process in the population, because within a period of 2 or 3 years, that batch basically came back and it continued to increase linearly. So I'm concerned about the impact of this pandemic on the life expectancy of the population, but even more on the quality of life, the mental health, and the economic situation. But on life expectancy, I think we're going to rebound. I think we're going to come back, and this is going to be resolved like we saw in the Spanish flu pandemic. Just an idea. And just on another aspect, maybe what happened in the 90s was Cosiga or Ascalfaro. That was maybe what happened in the 90s. I don't know if it was an impact of the political government in Italy and the decisions that were taken. But a final point is that you mentioned the big inequalities that exist by income in Italy, but also in Italy are quite visible some very large geographical inequalities, north and south. There is a big gradient. And so just wanted to bring those 3 points for discussion, Stefano. Thank you very much.
Okay. Shall I reply directly or take more questions? Because these are already quite absolutely interesting. And starting from the first one, yes, we know the lesson of the Spanish flu. And I'm not expecting, if not a small dent, perhaps in the future mortality figures. But what I fear is that because of the differences that we started to notice is that if on average population will take again, and particularly in consideration that it is differently from the Spanish flu, that we are losing mainly elderly people. So eventually in few years, this will be forgotten. My question is, will it be forgotten for all the population subgroups, or those differences that we call inequalities will remain for some groups? And of course, we cannot tell now, but from the first signals, well, this is scary. This is scary. And also because, as you mentioned, we know that the effect of the pandemic is not only mortality. The effect of pandemic is a big economic crisis, is mental health, stress, and we know that this is not equal in among the population strata, if not in very few countries. Of course, in some countries, the strong intervention from governments and in EU, now it will happen also in US, will in some way modify these big prices. But still, my fear, and particularly if we do not take the perspective of selected intervention to help the more fragile population, while the effect on health and eventually mortality, but on health will be major ones. Because certainly what has been produced by the pandemic, there are 2 effects. The fragile population has been eaten more than the rest of the population, because it's a fashionable term, the resilience, so the ability of responding of the fragile population by definition is less than the rest of the population. But the other aspect is because of the economic crisis that has selected, hidden different parts of the population, the fragile group has increased in several countries, certainly true in Italy. Then geographical aspect, that's really very true. And if you take a map of Italy, you can overlap the map of poverty, the map of income distribution, the map of most of the risk factors, and eventually the map of health outcome, and are absolutely just the same. And with some colleague of mine, with the surveillance system that we have on risk factors, we have done several times, just put in different color from different region, and the gradient is all there. for I would say not for all the risk factors, but for most of the risk factors. The only exception is alcohol, and because in the north part of Italy, the richer part, we drink a bit more. But for the rest, it is amazing. So the correspondence is really very, very high. And I was looking at also at work that try to link longevity and geographical areas in the US, and the result is pretty the same. So area in which there is a lower level of education, interesting enough, higher level of income disparity measured with the Gini index, while those are the area in which longevity is lower than the other. So observing it not only at state level, but I was just reading in these days an article that I've done this at the county level. So also with at a very small geographical area. And I think this is very interesting for research, because there is a lot to understand, a lot to know about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see a hand or a chat, so perhaps I can use my chance here, Stefano. I was puzzled to see this, the trend in longevity among the Latinos in the US. And there seemed to be in the trend, there seemed to be an advantage. And then during the Corona year, it dropped into a disadvantage. I mean, this is really, it didn't flatten or what, it dropped into a disadvantage. And your short comment on this was, this is because of behavioral factors. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how could that be, and what are the behavioral factors that turned from an advantage into a disadvantage?
No, the behavioral factor is before, so the advantage, okay, and mainly because of diet. The Latino have a slightly different diet from, particularly from the white population, and also from the black population. The use of junk food, of certain junk food, that is high in cholesterol, high in fat, is not typical of the American Latinos. And that justified the difference before the COVID. COVID is instead not related with particular mortality, is not related to behaviors, is related to age structure in some way. So of course, having more longevity, the Latino population has been eaten more, paradoxically, and particularly in the US, to the access to care.
And today, just today, in the
and certainly that has been something. So it is known that the Latino population has much lower access to care, particularly to hospital care. That is, if you are not if you don't have a very good insurance, very few little can afford it with a salary, and the insurance coverage among Latinos is lower than the rest of the population, and that could explain that effect.
That is paralleled by something that was just published today for Switzerland, where they found a clear correlation of COVID-19 health problems with the density of housing and the actually using public transportation. And I can see that this would apply also for this Latino population in the US. So first it was a behavioral factor that was driving it, then it becomes a structural inequality factor. I find this fascinating. And
yes, actually, I didn't mention quite explicitly. Longevity is tricky and interesting at the same time because it's very highly composite. So you have together all the behavioral risk factors and the access to health services combined together. So sometimes these combine in the same way. So for instance, the Black population has a lower level of both. Instead, they can be combined differently, and that's the case, interesting case of the Latino population, that for the part of the behavioral risk worked pretty well, but once the access start to be very important, as during the pandemic, well, they lost.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then I have a final question on that leads more to the policy side that we are interested in, and that poses all these challenges. I was kind of, I found it provocating when you said that policies that target the general population, you know, they don't work, you said. But then I remember that you yourself, didn't you do that study and the intervention with helmet use? Was it in Cambodia or so? And this was not really a particular part of the population. There was a new law, a traffic law. They introduced helmets, and obviously it had a very significant effect on the health of the population. So isn't that contradictory, what you said?
Yes and no. I'm not saying that the policy targeted to the general population are not working. Sometimes they can produce a very important gain. I say that's quite often, and that's not the case of Cambodia, they have a mean effect that is important, but they have a much lower effect on the tails of the distribution. Mm-hmm. And actually, this is why that generally they produce a significant mean effect, but they increase the variability of the problem that we are dealing with. Increasing the variability, those that have more problem end out to have even more problems. And that's why that's the reason of failure. So it's not a failure that you see at the general level, is a failure in reducing the gap. Okay, it's a failure in reducing the gap, and this is very true also in very egalitarian countries. I've done this study when I was in Australia, that is quite egalitarian country, but then also there the average was increasing in most of the health indicators, but then the variability was increasing as well. Okay. So they also there they left behind an important part of the population, increasing the gap eventually.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense. Thank you very much. So we are kind of exceeding the time. Is there anybody else who would like to raise an issue with Stefano, or a topic that we want to discuss, or a question? I see only Oscar unmuted, but I have only 10 of you on the screen. So please raise your voice. If there's somebody else, Oscar, why don't you start?
Just to add to the previous discussion, there's also a problem of access to information in the Latino population, which we are seeing now with the vaccination programs that are being rejected by the Latino population as well. There is also a lot of not only access to healthcare, but also the type of work that they do. They work a lot in restaurants or in services, and they need to be present. So that also increases the exposure. But just to highlight that the access to good information is something that is very important and that we have underestimated during the pandemic. We have left the space to charlatans and to people to brainwash the population, to put it that way. And there's been a lot of publicity of Bill Gates wanting to put a microchip here and there, or all kind of conspiracy theories that have been really polluting the minds of the Latin population, in particular because of the language.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I know a group, I think somewhere in Bern or so, that works a lot on critical health literacy. I think this is what is needed for this. So people need to learn to deal with this uncertainty, with the infodemics and all this. And perhaps certain subpopulation, this applies even more. That would make a lot of sense. And I find it wonderful. This is exactly what we are discussing this afternoon. That's public health. We do not fear complexity. There are all these different behavioral, structural, medical, all these aspects are coming in, and we are facing it. So that's, I think that's really exciting, and that is public health. So if there are no further questions, I would like to close here and thank Stefano again for a super interesting presentation, especially for those of us not familiar with demographic and this type of population data. Stefano, thank you very much. And I hope we can invite you again, and definitely you need to come to Bern. We do other swimming.
You owe me a dinner.
yes, we could do. Okay.
No, joking apart, it has been a pleasure, really. And luckily, with this system, we can share the little knowledge we have. And I think it's a sign of resilience. So it is important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye. See you next time in the 4th lecture, Bern Lecture 2021. Bye-bye.
Take care.